Okay. And then I'm going to share and then. Hello, everybody in the room and online. Welcome to the Weatherhead East Asia Institute and to a talk today by Dr. Kevin Fogg. Kevin is a graduate of Duke University and got his graduate degrees from Yale, all three of them, and then went on to teach at Oxford for 8 years and is a specialist on Indonesian Islam. He wrote his book, which is I guess your dissertation on the Indonesian Islamic Revolution, but looking at the role that Islam played during the revolution, something which is extremely pertinent today because of the way that hardline Islamists are trying to say that Pancasila was theirs. And that it's been misconstrued. And recently he's been working on this issue of mainline Islamic organizations, and he will explain why he uses the term mainline rather than mainstream or establishment. And it's going to be a very interesting comparison with Protestantism and mainline Protestantism. So Kevin, over to you.
I think I'll be standing, and I hope that the friends on the Zoom are able to hear me okay. I hope that y'all are able to see me a little bit. Let me just share a few slides. Okay, so hopefully our friends on Zoom can also now see these slides. As an Indonesia talk, I feel like I need to begin with in the name of the Lord, the Merciful and the Gracious. I'm delighted to have some friends here in the room. I'm delighted to have more friends online watching us live, and some who I think might be watching us after the fact. Thanks especially to Nicole Tunjing Abuitas, who invited me but is unable to get here because of transportation difficulties. So many thanks to Nicole as she's watching this after the fact. And thanks to Sydney Jones for stepping into the breach and guiding us through this talk. What I want to talk about today, Lord willing, is about, let me just make this disappear. Here we go. Is to talk about mainline Islamic organizations in Indonesia and why they're so important, right? Why these religious organizations form the backbone of Indonesian civil society, I would argue for the last 100 years or so. And also why these organizations are a bit different than ones outside of Indonesia, right? Not just that these Islamic organizations are important in Indonesia, but that they are of a different character than Islamic organizations that we find in other parts of the Muslim world, even next door in Malaysia or in Brunei or in southern Thailand. I've got 4 characteristics for why I think that these organizations are unique, right? The combination of 4 characteristics makes them different from Islamic associational life in other parts of the Muslim world. One of the things that I, as a historian, because, you know, as Sydney said, I got all those labor-intensive degrees at a university up the road, but they were all in history. And so as a historian, I want to think about how these organizations evolved over a century, right? And there are certain highs and lows and challenges and opportunities that a wide range of organizations experience together. And by looking at a bunch of them simultaneously, we can see the structural impacts, right? This wasn't just about the personalities at play in specific organizations. It was about structures in Indonesian society and history and in the Indonesian state that pushed these organizations in certain directions. And then finally, I want to highlight 3 regional organizations that don't get much play. We've got 2 big organizations in Indonesia that anybody working on the country has probably heard of. But I want to highlight 3 regional organizations that bring out those dynamics and give us a different flavor for what Islamic associational life in Indonesia looks like. Yes, here we go. So to begin with, I'm going to start off here in the States with mainline Protestant denominations, which is how scholars in the US, scholars of religion at places like Columbia, at places like University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, where I'm currently based, at places like UPenn and Duke and Harvard, have talked about religious life in this country over the last century. So some of you, if you've been out to Philadelphia, may have ever seen the main line of railroads going west from Philly out into the suburbs, right, to Bryn Mawr and Villanova and out there. And the name for these denominations, right, the American Baptist Churches USA, Disciples of Christ, the Episcopal Church, Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, PCUSA, United Church of Christ, United Methodist Church, comes actually not from their theological position being mainline. It comes from the mainline train outside of Philadelphia, because a couple of these groups, including American Baptist churches, where my mother actually worked for a couple of years, have their offices on that main line. ABC USA is at Valley Forge. But they got together about 112 years ago for a conference out on the main line where they sort of said, we are going to be the core of religious life. At that time, more than half of the citizens of the United States were members of one of these churches, one of these denominations. And so they said, we should coordinate with one another about how we're engaged in our work in society, in our vision for where America is going forward. And since that meeting, I think it was in 1912, mainline in quotation marks and inverted commas has been used as a category in American life, usually for these denominations, but sometimes for denominations beyond these that adhere to certain key characteristics, right? Where they are large and spread around a wide geographic area, where they are theologically sort of in the middle, right? They're not radical this side, radical that side. They're theologically sort of towing the line. They're normative in the United States. And they're normative in the way that you engage in religious life in your community. Now, I was actually raised south of the Mason-Dixon line because God is merciful. And so I was raised not in one of these churches. I was raised in the Southern Baptist Church. But we in the Southern Baptist Church have a lot of these same characteristics. And so some of you might have had family members who grew up in a strong church environment where you're in church on Sunday morning, Sunday night, and usually Wednesday night, where you have a youth auxiliary for women and a youth auxiliary for men, where you are engaged in social efforts and teaching in addition to the worship and the theological stuff. And so for me, this was the rhythm of daily life growing up in Virginia. This is a tradition that I know incredibly well. And so I was really struck when I first started doing research in Indonesia on Indonesian religious life, that they have many of these same structural habits, structural patterns in mass Islamic organizations that I thought of as being characteristic of mainline Protestant denominations in the US. Oh, put it over here. Okay. So in Indonesia, like the mainline Protestant denominations, we have mass Islamic groups that dominated religious life and in many ways civil society leading up to the 1970s. From the 1970s, you get shifting modes of religious authority. Here in the US, you might think of this as being Jerry Falwell. You might think of this as being televangelists. You might think of this as being non-denominational movements, Campus Crusade for Christ, InterVarsity, a lot of the groups that you'll find on a campus like Columbia. And since the 1970s, you've seen a decline where now it's under a quarter of the United States affiliates themselves with a mainline Protestant denomination, which is a rapid change since the 1950s. And so I want to use some of the normative patterns about organization, the normative roles in national life, and the dynamics of rise and decline from the US to also then think about religious life in Indonesia. Now, what is this religious life that I'm talking about? There's two really big mass Islamic organizations that y'all have probably heard of if you've studied Indonesia at all. Nahdlatul Ulama is often called the largest Islamic organization in the world. Certainly anyone in NU calls it the largest Islamic organization in the world. And there's some basis for that, right? If you judge by the number of people who go to a mosque where the Friday preacher has some NU affiliation, they might be the largest mass Islamic organization in the world. But if you look at the number of folks who are actively involved in one of the NU auxiliaries or sub-organizations or actively thinking about NU for religious guidance, it's up in the air. The second largest organization in Indonesia is called Muhammadiyah. And there's a theological difference between these two. And any religious scholars who are really interested in the theological difference in the room? No. I mean, basically, there was a time when Muslims believed you needed to follow not just the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ, but also the way that theology then built up over the centuries with derivative interpretations of the law and then a derivative of the derivative interpretations of the law. So you get a full theological corpus that's big and complex. And the folks in NU believed in following one of those four accepted corpus, the Shafi'i corpus of jurisprudence. The folks in Muhammadiyah, founded 112 years ago, said, we don't need all of that accrued theology over 14 centuries. We can go back to the Quran and the sayings and doings of the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ himself and derive this afresh. And so they're not in the schools of jurisprudence or post schools of jurisprudence. So these two large organizations have a slightly different theological approach. Many days they get along, some days they don't. There's definitely a theological difference between them. But between the two of them, they have absolutely dominated the study of Islam in Indonesia. So this is, by scholars in France. This is by scholars in Japan. This is by scholars in Australia. Indonesian scholars themselves. Indonesian scholars now based in the United States. American scholars based in the United States. I mean, we just have, dozens and dozens of works that are focused on NU and Muhammadiyah as being the sources of Islamic authority, the sources of Islamic life, the centers of civil religion for Indonesia. And that makes a lot of sense, right? These are large organizations, influential organizations. I'll tell you from one of the people on this row of books, and I won't tell you which one, was doing some field work and wanted to get numbers on these groups. And so went to the head of NU and said, how many folks are NU members? And you said, we're not really sure. Are you checking with any other organizations? And the researcher said, well, I also need to get this from Muhammadiyah. And so he said, okay, we're going to look at our books. We're going to check these numbers. Go and ask the Muhammadiyah folks first. And then, we'll be checking while you're asking them. And so he goes to Muhammadiyah. Muhammadiyah is very famous for clean organization. And so the Muhammadiyah folks say, okay, well, if you look at the number of graduates of our schools, it's this many millions. If you look at the number of people who go to our mosques, it's this many millions. If you look at the number of people who take advantage of our social welfare organizations, it's this many millions. And so he gets some number, umpteen million. After a couple of weeks, he goes back and checks with his NU contacts and says, so did you ever find a number? Here's some ways you can calculate. Did you ever find a number? And he said, yeah. So how many did Muhammadiyah say? Well, umpteen million, calculating this way. Okay, the rest are NU. And the amazing thing is the people in NU seem to truly believe that, right? They really believe that if you're a Muslim and you're not Muhammadiyah, you are generically NU. But in fact, when I look at Indonesian mass Islamic organizations, there's a lot more organizations than just those that we should think about as following this pattern of being a mainline Islamic organization in Indonesia. So I put a couple stars up here. NU and Muhammadiyah are in the red, right? Two largest ones. NU is currently based in Jakarta, although it was founded in East Java. Muhammadiyah, the headquarters is still technically in Yogyakarta, in Central Java, or Yogyakarta, a special administrative district in the central part of Java. But then you have three organizations that I am adding to the discussion in this book with deep dives. Jamiat al-Washliyah, based in North Sumatra, founded up in Medan, although they moved their headquarters to Jakarta in the 1970s. Nahdlatul al-Watan is based here on Lombok, the island east of Bali. And then Al Khairat is based in Palu, Central Sulawesi. But those aren't the only ones, right? Oh, let me go back. Sorry about that. We've also got, like PUSA, founded in the 1930s in Aceh. You've got PERTI, Persatuan Tarbiyah Islamiyah, the Indonesian Islamic Educational Union. Mathal Anwar, based in West Sumatra. Darul Da'wah Irsyad, based in South Sulawesi. There's even organizations like Musyawarat al-Talibin that rose in the same era. This is the star that I have in South Kalimantan. Musyawarat al-Talibin, large, influential organization. A later speaker of the Indonesian parliament, Idham Khalid, came out of Musyawarat al-Talibin. But Musyawarat al-Talibin is one of the organizations that did not survive the Japanese occupation in Indonesia, when civil society kind of got either smashed or set aside in a lot of parts of the country, especially outside of Java. Civil society was really sidelined. These organizations are spread across the archipelago, certainly across the Muslim parts of the archipelago. These organizations are fairly dominant in their provinces, right? An organization like Nahdlatul Watan has had someone in either the governor's office or the lieutenant governor's office for the last 17 years. The largest caucus in the North Sumatra provincial legislature is the Jamiat al-Washliyah caucus. And so these organizations, even though they're not NU and Muhammadiyah, are very influential and important in their regions. And that's why I want to bring them into the conversation. Okay. So how am I defining a mainline Islamic organization? And how is it different from some other groups? So I've chewed on this for a while, and I've come up with 4 conditions that I think all of these groups that were on the map meet, and other organizations don't meet all 4. So here's what I'm working with. First, these organizations are large, influential, and comprehensive. Large makes sense. This means millions of followers. And all of the groups, even the smallest ones on my map, have literally millions of followers. Remember that Indonesia's quite a large population, quite a large Muslim population. So you can have 3 million followers and dominate a province and still not be a big player on the national scene. They're influential locally in politics, but also in social life, right? These are the folks who are telling you when you should observe the holy days, right? Who's seen the moon for Eid al-Fitr, which we had last week, for example. And they're also comprehensive. Now, what does that mean? Comprehensive in the sense that they're not just providing education, they're not just providing social works, they're not just engaged in proselytization, but they're engaged in all of these facets of activity as an organization. The joke for this is usually around Muhammadiyah, because it's such a comprehensive organization that they're normative in this way. So you can be born in a Muhammadiyah hospital, because Muhammadiyah runs hospitals. And then you can go to a Muhammadiyah preschool, and then you go to a Muhammadiyah elementary school, middle school, high school. While you're doing that, maybe you're doing your shopping at a Muhammadiyah supermarket, right? You go to a Muhammadiyah university. On Thursday nights after you graduate from university, you're still getting together with a Muhammadiyah prayer group or a Muhammadiyah study group. You eventually retire and you live in a Muhammadiyah retirement home. And then when you're buried, a Muhammadiyah Islamic leader, a Muhammadiyah alim, does your funeral and buries you in a Muhammadiyah cemetery, right? So when these people are comprehensive, they are comprehensive literally from cradle until grave, right? They're engaged not just in the education, not just in the theological guidance, in propagation, but also in the social works. And so these organizations are impressive in the scope that they hold. A lot of places, you have organizations that might be large and influential, but they're not comprehensive. They might just be doing education. Sometimes you have groups that are comprehensive, but they're not that large or influential, right? They're comprehensive for a small community. One of the things that stands out about Indonesian organizations, they are large, influential, and comprehensive. Secondly, they are modern in form. Now, sometimes when I say this, I get folks who are Shafi'i in jurisprudence, right? Who follow the 14 centuries of accrued theology, and they say, oh, we're not modernist. I'm saying, no, theologically, you are holding to a staunch, well-established and well-understood line of theology. But in form, these things are modern because they come with a constitution and bylaws. All of them have a constitution and bylaws. They come with regular conventions to choose their leaders, right? Sometimes every 3 years, sometimes every 5. Depends on the organization, how they set that up. But they will have regular conventions. They will have official positions in the organization, like secretary, like treasurer, like vice chair of the social affairs committee for this province, right? And so all of that trapping of modernity, right? The trappings of organizational modernity sets Indonesian organizations apart from some of the organizations that you might see, for example, in northern Nigeria, from some of the Sufi-inspired organizations that you might see in a place like Turkey, right? A lot of those groups are not open and straightforward and modern in their organization. And so they don't have those trappings of modernity. Now, Sydney pressed me on this a little bit earlier, saying, oh, well, some of these groups, like NU, it's never actually a question going into the convention, who's going to get elected leader. That's probably true. But the fact that it's important for the NU leaders to go through the trappings of organizational modernity is still important. The fact that they have a constitution and bylaws that they can use to protect the organization or to use against their critics or whatever it is, they are using these organizational trappings in a way that you would not have seen in Indonesia before 1910. And that to me is important, that Indonesian religious life, Indonesian Islamic life, chooses to use those trappings as a core part of how they organize Muslim associationalism. So that's modern in form. And then 2 conditions about the relationship of these groups to the state. One, all of these groups that I'm talking about in Indonesia support the Indonesian state. They support the idea of Indonesia. They don't always support the specific politician in power, but they think that Indonesia makes sense as the governance vehicle for their followings. That was true before Indonesia became independent. I have argued in the past, and my book on the Indonesian Revolution was mentioned, that groups like Muhammadiyah, groups like NU, were very invested in Indonesian nationalism and literally fought, spilled blood in order to achieve Indonesian independence. But since Indonesia became independent, these groups are the ones who have said, yes, we like the idea of Indonesia in this form, all of these islands together. We accept the idea of Indonesia with its constitution. They have tried to change it, but through democratic means. These groups have not gone into rebellion. We think that Indonesia is the correct political vehicle. We are not advocating for pan-Islamism, where we unite under a caliphate, run out of somewhere by someone. And so these groups are fundamentally nationalists. The picture that you see here is actually a group of, it's in North Maluku, so the place that we get our spices from, the place that launched colonialism in Ternate, because of the cloves and the nutmeg that European adventurers wanted to buy and bring back to Europe. That place is very strongly pro-Al Khairat. And so you see here a group of young female students marching down the street carrying Indonesian flags. And then you can almost see here in the middle, this thing right here. Let's try that. Okay, this thing right here is a portrait of the founder of Al Khairat that they are carrying like under an Indonesian flag, right? That their great alim, their great leader of this organization is pro-nationalist. That man never spoke Indonesian. He only spoke Arabic his entire life. And yet he is taken as an Indonesian nationalist. A fascinating thing just to show how much they support the state. But then these groups, even though they support the state, they are, and this is a thing that we could debate in the current moment, but as a general rule over the last 100 years, they are not controlled by the state. One of the examples I use for this, last week Indonesia had Eid al-Fitr, the holiday for the end of the fasting month of Ramadan. And the state of Indonesia generally follows the Islamic organizations on what day you're going to name as Eid al-Fitr, right? There's a minister of religion. The minister of religion can pass an official decree on this, but he's looking at NU and Muhammadiyah and saying, when do they say that Eid will begin? When do they say that Ramadan will begin and then Ramadan will end? It's these organizations that are dictating things to the state. The state is not able to tell them traditionally and generally who will become the next head of the organization. The state is not going to dictate to them theological positions, although the state might put up strong boundaries of what falls in and what falls out and enforce some penalties on the organizations when they do something that falls out. And some of the organizations I'm looking at have done that, especially under the Suharto regime. They were advocating for positions that the Suharto regime didn't particularly like. In recent years, there's been a lot of debate about how these groups are being cowed by the state, but I still don't think they're controlled by it, a thing we can debate. These four conditions, to me, when you hold all four of them, it strikes me as peculiar. It strikes me as notable that all of the 10, dozen, however many it is, organizations in Indonesia that I would categorize as mainline can meet all four of these conditions. And I have not found an organization outside of Indonesia that meets all four, right? When we think about something like the Muslim Brotherhood, its relationship with the state is very different from this. When we think about Sufi organizations, when we think about diaspora organizations that might be comprehensive but are not large and influential, it's very hard to get an organization outside of Indonesia that meets all four of these. Even in neighboring Malaysia, you don't have organizations that are truly independent of the state. Right? In Malaysia, Islam is really much more strongly controlled by the state, and often at that local level, at that provincial level in Malaysia. The local king is the final say on Islam in Perak or in Kedah. And so it's hard to get that independent voice. So these are my four conditions for a mainline Islamic organization in Indonesia. Okay. Oddly enough, those same four characteristics could describe America's mainline Protestant denominations as well, right? Large, influential, and comprehensive. I don't know if y'all have this as much up here, but the second largest medical group in North Carolina, where I'm working, is Baptist Medical Group, right? The Baptists in the U.S. have done all of those comprehensive things. Definitely modern informed. My mother and my grandfather are past presidents of the Virginia Baptist General Assembly, right? They have to meet every year. They have to elect a president. They follow a constitution and bylaws. They are supportive of the state, right? In fact, they align their jurisdictions with the legal jurisdictions of the United States in the same way that Indonesian organizations divide up their jurisdictions within NU or Muhammadiyah or Al Khairat with the provinces of Indonesia. Perfect alignment geographically. And yet they're not controlled by it. And so it's striking to me that American mainline organizations meet these exact same characteristics that Indonesian, what I would call mainline organizations do. this is about halfway through. And so this is the time where folks generally let their minds wander. And I thought this might be a good time to let minds wander. I better hold this so folks who are watching this asynchronously or watching us online can see. Just to give you an idea of how comprehensive these things are, I've brought a couple of show and tell items. So for example, if you are a college student on Lombok, you can be in the college student auxiliary of Nahdlatul Watan. And I actually was given a medal by Hima, which was lovely, for giving a little talk to them. So just these kind of accoutrements go around. Also from Nahdlatul Watan, a pocket handbook of the poetry of the founder of Nahdlatul Watan. Most of this is in Indonesian, that's transcribed in the Roman letters, so you can see it, but it's all sort of quatrains. The middle section of this is actually poems of 5 lines, but the first line is always Aduh sayang, oh my beloved. And so these pocket books that folks will carry around literally as sort of an amulet almost of the organization. And then they even come with flags, right? So this is the flag.
I can open it.
Well, we better hold it together here.
Okay.
This is the flag of the Nahdlatul Watan school, Nahdlatul Watan Dunia Islamiyah, and I better turn it actually. So if we turn it this way, okay. For those of y'all who are real Indonesia geography buffs, you can see the outline on here of the island of Lombok. So this is the island of Lombok shape right there inside the star. And then inside of that, you get the symbol of Nahdlatul Watan. So these flags you actually see flying on the island of Lombok, not just outside schools, but outside of homes, right? They have all of these trappings. Okay, so let me pass this one around. I want all these things back. It took me a long time to get them, but I thought I'd show them. The organizations have their own newspapers. So I brought a couple of photocopies of the Al Khairat newspaper from the 1970s when it started, right? They send it out once a week, but they're sending this out with some guidance on what you should preach about on Friday. But then also just like local stuff. So what are the common diseases in our area and how can we help to alleviate them, right? What's the news about the latest prices in coconut, right? Because that's one of the major products in Central Sulawesi. So they put out their own newspapers. Mm-hmm. In fact, the largest continually published newspaper in Indonesia is the Muhammadiyah newspaper. So they're important not just for their own members, but in the history of Indonesia, these things are quite notable. And then they put out plenty of educational materials. This VCD that I brought is songs that you can sing with preschool-age children to teach them religious doctrines from Al Washliya in Medan. They've got a fantastically voiced choir of women in their women's auxiliaries singing on this thing. Makes sense. North Sumatra is a place that's kind of famous for sitting around and singing on street corners. And so they do their own singing here. So I'm just going to pass those around in case folks are getting a little bit weary of listening to me talk right before lunch or right after lunch. Okay. These organizations have evolved over the 20th century in ways that I find to be interesting and parallel. Most of the organizations began in the 1910s and 20s, and a lot of them began in competition with Christian missionaries. So Muhammadiyah, which was founded in 1911, was engaged in social enterprises early on, partly because Christian missionaries, many of them Dutch, had come in and were engaged in social enterprises in places like Yogyakarta. And so when a Catholic hospital gets set up, the Muslims are like, oh, we better set up a Muslim hospital. When the Catholics are engaged in that kind of formal education that has grades and classes and graduations, the Muslims said, oh, well, we should engage in that kind of formal education that has grades and class and education, so they wouldn't be left behind by the Christian organizations. So I think one of the things that folks haven't paid enough attention to, that folks haven't been entirely honest about, is that some of the form that was taken up by mass Islamic organizations in Indonesia early on was form adopted from Christian missionary organizations that were operative in Indonesia from the teens and 20s. When Muhammadiyah was founded in 1911, they're the forerunner and in many ways the model, the normative example of a mass Islamic organization. And so you had other groups that then were competing with Muhammadiyah. And so in the 1920s and into the 1930s even, you get just this huge wave, this plethora of organizations. Almost every province where I've done work in the Dutch archives on this had some organization pop up that said, we're going to be the organization that is not Muhammadiyah, right? We're going to be the organization that protects the theological belief in those 1400 years of accrued theology. A lot of those groups did not survive into the 1940s because the Japanese occupation was quite harsh. So in Gorontalo, for example, you see Nahdlatul Shafi'iyya, right? The emergence or the renaissance of the Shafi'is, right? The people who follow the school of jurisprudence. I already mentioned Mushawarat Talabin, the consultation of the religious students that rose up in Banjarmasin in Kalimantan. But then you get groups like Purti in West Sumatra that did survive. You get groups like Jamiat al-Washliya formed in Medan that is very active until this day, right? That were founded in a lot of ways in competition with Muhammadiyah, right? Muhammadiyah makes it into their province and they say, we like all these things. We like having the schools and the social activities and the outreach, the religious outreach, but we don't want to be Muhammadiyah. And so they're engaged in that competition with Muhammadiyah, not just with Christian missionaries. One of the characteristics that I have found of the groups that did survive through the 1930s and into the 40s, the ones that were engaged in more propagation work, more religious conversion work, were more likely to survive because they weren't just saying we're not Muhammadiyah. They're saying we're not Muhammadiyah and we want to spread this message to others. So this image that you see of the light of Islam held as a candle in the hands of Al-Jamiat al-Washliya is coming down into a traditionally Batak village. The Batak were an ethnic community in North Sumatra that were not, as a majority, converted to a world religion at the beginning of the 20th century. Many of them are today Christian. Some of them are today Muslim. Jamiat al-Washliya was very dedicated to propagating Islam in Batak lands. And so you see them here, sort of, this is the cover of their 5-year anniversary of their special Islamic mission for sending out to Batak areas. There's another thing that happens in the 1920s and 30s and even into the 40s that you get a bunch of schools that are founded in that new form, right? The idea that you'll have a school that is teaching not just Islamic subjects, not just how to recite texts, but also math or statistics or languages other than Arabic, right? You know, teaching Indonesian, but maybe even teaching Dutch or English. Those kinds of schools were propagating all over the country in the 1920s. And then in the 1930s, many of them would begin to establish new branch campuses. So if my headquarters is maybe, you know, let's say 118th Street, and then I establish a branch campus from one of my alumni who starts something down on 79th, you know, maybe I'll call this Columbia Islamic School, and then there'll be Columbia Islamic School 79th, and then they'll establish a branch over in Queens somewhere. Those schools were just loose networks in the 1930s, 1920s and 30s. And then those schools sometimes became the second wave of Islamic organizations in the 1940s and 50s, right? That it wasn't enough for me to just say, oh yeah, Columbia Islamic School here on 118th has this other school on 79th, has this other school in Queens. We wanted to establish a formal organization of these schools and then give it a constitution and bylaws, give it a sort of annual meeting, officers, all of these things. Because by doing that in the 1940s and 50s, we were able to capture government largesse, right? By organizing ourselves formally, we were able to get our guys in to become the district officiant of marriages, to become the head of the district office of religious affairs. By organizing formally, we were able to capture those really good government pension jobs. And that spurred a bunch of these loose networks of schools to become formal organizations in the 40s and 50s. From the 1930s to the 1950s, these groups were very strong proponents of Indonesian nationalism. One of the reasons why they have such a great footprint in the Dutch archives, like Nahdlatul Shafi'iyya, which you see on the side here, this is from Dutch archives of 1936, from Gorontalo, is because the Dutch saw them as a threat because they were constantly advocating for Indonesian independence, first for more Indonesian self-determination, but then for out-and-out independence from the Dutch. But I think the peak of these organizations was in the 1950s. They were fueled by Islamic politics, so there was a big debate and sometimes even battle in society about whether Indonesia would be based on Islam or whether Indonesia would be based on a non-sectarian motto called Pancasila. It's not non-religious, but it's non-sectarian between Islam, Christianity, and other faiths. And so that is fueling people to be very active in their Islamic organizations if they are Muslim, right? Because you've got this debate going on in society, a lot of polarization between Muslims and either non-pious Muslims or non-Muslims. This is also a moment when they have a big sort of reputational bonus from the work that they had done to advocate for Indonesian independence, right? These are folks who said, we were on the forefront in our local community of organizing a militia that fought against the Dutch in the 1940s. Muhammadiyah reaps a big benefit from that because they're seen as the forerunners, the pioneers of fighting for Indonesian independence in places even like Sumbawa, not just only on Java or on Sumatra. This is a time when they are providing a lot of the services that the Indonesian state does not yet have the organizational capacity to provide. So in the 1950s, the Indonesian state was not able to provide elementary schools, middle schools, high schools to meet the demand of the Indonesian people. And so a much larger proportion of the population was going to schools provided by these mass Islamic organizations, which is another thing that contributed to their sort of organizational peak in the 1950s and early 1960s. I would say in the United States, we would also call the 1950s the peak of the influence of American Protestantism, of mainline denominations on US political and social life. The 1960s through the 1980s is a bit of a wilderness for these folks, and there's a couple reasons for that. One is the army-backed authoritarian regime that came in from 1966 through 1998 was much less interested in accommodating these organizations and really wanted to limit political Islam. Some of these organizations chose to take an oppositional stance. Jamiat al-Washliyah in Medan is a famous one of those, that said, we will not accommodate what Suharto is trying to do, sidelining Islam in this country. And so they actually lost a number of lucrative gigs for them, right? They had been running the Friday prayers on the local radio station, lost that gig because they were too oppositional towards the Suharto regime. Another thing that was happening at this moment is a really difficult generational transition, right? The young guys who had founded some of these organizations in the 1930s were passing away. So if you were, in your 20s, let's say in the 1930s, by the 1960s, 1970s, you're passing away. So this is happening for Jamiat al-Washliyah. This is happening for Al-Khairat, based in Central Sulawesi. This is happening for Perti, based in West Sumatra. Mathal Anwar, Persatuan Umat Islam, right, are losing their leaders in the 60s and 70s. And that next generation, although they are well-established Islamic scholars, they have a lot of good knowledge, they didn't have the relationships with every single branch, having been the head teacher for all those years. Choosing who's going to be the successor can sometimes be very contentious in these organizations. And just that magic dust isn't there. And so a lot of these organizations are losing some of their tightness, losing some of their cohesion in that generational transition, which puts them into a bit of a wilderness, not just politically, but organizationally in the 60s through the 80s. They come back in a pretty strong way in the 1990s and 2000s. And this is something where I'm echoing the field, right? Talking about the rise of an Islamic civil society in the 1990s as part of the opposition to the late Suharto regime. You see here the three leaders of Indonesian politics in the immediate post-Suharto moment. Megawati Soekarno Putri, the woman that you see who's on the left of this image, not an Islamic leader. She comes from a political dynasty. But then the two fellows next to her, Abdurrahman Wahid in the center was the leader of NU, right, the largest mass Islamic organization. And then Amin Rais was the head of Muhammadiyah, right? It's not a coincidence that the two largest mass Islamic organizations in Indonesia also transformed into having the leaders of the president elected in 1999 by parliament and the speaker of parliament, I think Amin Rais was, in that post-transition era. Mass Islamic organizations were once again the backbone of life, of civil life in opposition to Suharto. At the same time, there are some structural transformations happening in Indonesia that were undermining what could have been big gains for them in this period. As more Indonesians moved to cities, they became less connected to the Islamic organizations that were providing services in rural areas, right? In cities, you get more government services. That's just a fact of Indonesian life. But also in cities, you're getting new types of Islamic authority, right? You're getting folks who are not connected to the Islamic organizations who can start a school or a mosque or a prayer group in cities. You're getting more Indonesian students who are going off to university and being sucked into the new kinds of Islamic organization, especially the quote-unquote Tarbiyah movement, today often thought of as aligned with PKS, the Partai Keadilan Sejahtera in Indonesian politics. Those folks are being pulled out of organizations, right? A high-performing, well-educated generation that could have been the next leaders of Muhammadiyah or Darul Da'wah wal Irshad instead are going to PKS because that's who's most active on university campuses. You're also getting accusations in this period of the Islamic organizations losing their old identity theologically, right? You're getting some new liberal tendencies, right? Along with democratization, there's new discourse around gender. There's new discourse around tolerance for other religious communities. And do we really need to be engaged in conversion? And so there's debates about liberalism, secularism, other things emerging in the 1990s in a fresh way that undermines the reputation of some of these longstanding mainline organizations in Indonesia. Anyone who's been in the United States for the last 30 years recognizes all of those same debates here, right? The fact that my mother got elected as the president of the Virginia Baptist General Assembly was contentious for some people who think that women shouldn't be leaders in Baptist life. Same debates going on in Indonesia. Not quite at the same level, right? You did not have a female head of any of these organizations until 1999, and that was only because she was the daughter of a founder of the organization that passed away. But similar questions are arising around the world and arising certainly in Indonesia in the 1990s. And with mass communications, those things can bounce around a whole lot faster. You're getting communications that are not dominated by the organization. It's no longer just the Al Khairat newspaper that's circulating in Central Sulawesi. You're getting new types of ways to communicate by text message, by printing your own things, by photocopying. That is so much easier able to penetrate into even the villages. That it's not just the folks in urban spaces, that you're getting a new challenge to the authority with those new means of communication. So that leaves us with the question of, was the 1990s and early 2000s a heyday or a swan song for these mainline Islamic organizations? Now, let me just quickly, and I know that we're running tight on time, introduce the three groups that I think are really interesting, that don't get a lot of play, certainly in English and even in Indonesian. But looking at these groups alongside NU and Muhammadiyah gives us a better idea of what is common, what is structural, versus what is unique to specific organizations. All three of these groups identify themselves as being the third largest in Indonesia. Now, that cannot possibly be the case. But it does give you a sense that they're all super influential in their regions, right? All of them say, oh yes, there's NU and Muhammadiyah, and then there's us. And because they're active in different corners of the archipelago, that kind of makes sense. Jamiatul Ashliyah was founded by a collective of students in Medan, North Sumatra, first as a debating society in 1930. They started to found a bunch of schools. They started to try and convert Batak people to Islam, and they were racing against Christian missionaries at the same time. One of the real challenges in Jamiatul Ashliyah is that they were an organization from 1930s. They were an organization earlier than others. And they became a member organization of the Islamic political party Masyumi when that was founded, and created a special, it's called Anggota Istimewa, right? A special member category for Islamic organizations at its founding in 1945. Because of that, Jamiatul Ashliyah has been more involved in politics from earlier on than a lot of the other regional organizations, right? Al Khairat, Nahdlatul Watan, that I'll talk about, didn't have as direct of a political affiliation in the 1950s. Since the 1950s, it's been really hard for Jamiatul Ashliyah to balance that political mission, right? Having an explicit orientation as a special member of a political party with the educational and social mission that they also carry. And so Jamiatul Ashliyah was hit harder than some of these other groups when they were in the political wilderness in the 1970s. For those of you who know Indonesian Islam well, you might have heard of Ustaz Abdul Somad, UAS, who was educated entirely at Jamiatul Ashliyah schools, but chooses not to affiliate with that organization anymore. He's tried to wipe that out of his biography. But if you actually look at the man, Jamiatul Ashliyah schools until he graduated from high school. So that's just, one voice coming out of this Sumatran organization. Jamiatul Ashliyah did actually move their headquarters to Jakarta in the 1970s as part of, because Suharto saw them as the third largest in the country at the time. Part of the centralizing push was national organizations should have a national headquarters in Jakarta. So they participated in that. Next up is Nahdlatul Watan. So Nahdlatul Watan, fascinating thing, because it's a very orthodox organization in a lot of ways, but it's a very Sasak organization in a lot of ways. Sasak is the majority ethnicity on Lombok, that island east of Bali. And so a Sasak Haji went off to Mecca and Medina, the holy city of Islam, and studied for about 7 years at a school there, Madrasah Salatiyah, that's made a bunch of educational leaders, not just in Southeast Asia, but in South Asia and in other parts of the Muslim world. And when he came back, he wanted to establish a really intense training school that would educate folks in good Arabic, serious theology, but then also provide some of those other skills, right? How to do math, how to speak Dutch. Later on, they changed it to English. When he came back and founded that school, he called it Nahdlatul Watan Diniyah Islamiyah, which means Renaissance of the nation, right? Watan is the word for nation. This is the same Nahdlatul as Nahdlatul Ulama, right, in you. But Nahdlatul Watan sounds very, very nationalist. Founding that in 1935 was a bit of a sign to our friends in the Dutch colonial government that this was going to be a nationalist organization. At the same time, In 1935, it could have been a little bit unclear. Is that nation Indonesia or is it the Sasak nation? Because he was engaged in a bunch of local ethnic traditional practices that you just don't find anywhere else, right? The founder of this group, Muhammad Zainuddin Abdul Majid, believed in some of the traditions about the mountain at the center of Lombok, Gunung Ranjani, and the spirit guardians of that thing. And he would make pilgrimages up to the mountain. And if you look at the little pocket-sized handbook of his poetry, he's invoking some of the mythical goddesses that guard the mountain of Ranjani. Dewi Anjani is one of them, famously. And so he's both very orthodox, right? He's teaching a lot of good Arabic. He's teaching people, very clear guidelines for how to live in line with the Quran. But he's also doing things like, when he holds a major social event, he will engage in cutting, the first haircut for a Sasak toddler, which is one of the 4 transitions in traditional Sasak life, right? So he's integrating that Sasak identity with the Islamic identity, which made him incredibly successful at bringing a lot more Sasak people in line with textual, modern, theologically reformed Islam. That fellow lived until the age of at least 91. There's some debate about how old he was exactly when he passed away, but he lived until the age of at least 91, which was 1997. And what a time to pass away, because Indonesia was in the middle of a political transition. And so they had this wild thing that happened at his passing, where there were 2 factions for who should take over. He had designated his son-in-law, that he only had 2 children, the founder, only had 2 children. They were both daughters. He had tried to make his son-in-law from his elder daughter the head in the 1970s, didn't go anywhere. Failed. He took back control for another 20 years. He had designated his son-in-law through his younger daughter as his successor. But wouldn't you know it, because he lived to the age of 91, his son-in-law through the older daughter passed away 40 days before he did in 1997. And it was unclear who was going to be the head. They go to a convention. They go to the Mu'tamar. Out of the clear western sky, the younger daughter is named as the head of this organization. So you have a woman who is the head of a mass Islamic organization in Indonesia in 1997. Wild, unheard of, pretty radical, and pretty controversial even for people within the organization, especially her own sister, who said, well, if it was on the table that a woman could become head, why didn't I become head? I'm the older sister. Well, there's some things about that, right? They're from different wives, because Muhammad Zainuddin Abdul Majid had multiple wives. The older sister's husband had been estranged from the organization. She had divorced the man and married someone else. I mean, there's a bunch of things here. But the older sister was very unhappy about this, and as were a lot of other people, including one of the brothers of the founder and some others. And so they held what was called a Muktamar Reformasi, right? This was the Reformation era in Indonesian politics. So they had a Reformation Congress and named the son of the elder daughter, this man that you see in the political poster here, Tuan Guru Bajang, as the head of the organization in a rival Congress. And so Nahdlatul Watan has basically been split since 1997. Now, 2 years ago, they had a government-mediated reconciliation that all it really did was formalize the split of this into 2 different things. So before, the school was called NWDI, NWDI, Nahdlatul Watan Diniyah Islamiyah, and the organization was just called Nahdlatul Watan. And now NWDI and NW have become separate organizations as of 2021. The sisters faction, who became the head, is the NW faction, and the grandsons faction, this fella, became NWDI. They're no longer as violent as they were in 1998, 99, but there's still tension on the island between these 2 groups. Plenty of fascinating things going on there. But let me just point out Al Khairat, the last organization that I'll mention, which was founded actually by an Arab as a school in 1930. This is a Hadrami Arab. So the majority of Arabs in Indonesia are Hadramis, right, coming from that part of southern Yemen. And Sayyid Idris bin Salam al-Jufri, he's called Sayyid because he claims descent from the Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And he had been from a family of traders that had gone back and forth between Yemen and Indonesia for generations, right? But with the erection of national borders and citizenship in a new way in the 20th century, it became a time where if you go to a place, you kind of stay there. It's harder to just go back and forth in an itinerant lifestyle. So he was called to come to Indonesia, had a family on Java, went off to Sulawesi trading, and the local Arabs in Sulawesi said, we so desperately need a teacher here. Please, would you stay? And found a school. And so in addition to trading, Sayyid Idris founded a school in first Donggala and then Palu, that trained up so many students, and students from not just Palu area, but from across central Sulawesi and then northern Sulawesi, and then from Kalimantan and then from North Maluku. Because as a trader, he would go out and trade goods in all these places. He would go out with a full boat or a full oxen cart of goods. He would come back with a full boat or full oxen cart of students. And then he would send his graduates off to their home villages. They became this huge network. Now, they only became an organization in 1956. And this picture is from that first organizational conference. You can see the different towns from across Sulawesi and a couple from, so this is Palu, a couple from the Moluccas are also in here. They agreed to an organizational standard. They agreed to a constitution and bylaws, but they said all of us from this broad, ethnically heterogeneous region will stay under the leadership of an Arab. So you need to be in the family of Said Idris to be the Ketua Utama, the ultimate head of the organization. But then the organization is actually run day to day by a secretary general, the third position in this group. And in the secretary general position, Al Khairat has been more diverse than any other organization I know in Indonesia. From the 1970s, Al Khairat had a Chinese Indonesian secretary general, Muslim convert, Chinese Indonesian, pretty wild. They've had Bugis, they've had Kaili, they've had Banjar, they've had Una, they've had, all different ethnicities in that secgen position. There's a bit of a joke that you kind of need to add to the ethnic heterogeneity of the organization to be a really good candidate for secgen these days. Although they have had some repeats in the Kaili, which is the ethnicity around Palu, where the headquarters is. Now, Al Khairat, because of this Arab identity, a lot of the writing in English has focused on it as an Arab organization. But if you get down to the grassroots, actually most of the members of Al Khairat are not Arab, but they respect that Arab leadership, which makes them an interesting group to think through as a different flavor in the spectrum of Indonesian mass Islamic organizations. Now, I've talked for a long time, and thank you all for your patience. Thanks for the patience also of those who are watching us synchronously online or watching this after the fact. Let me end with two questions to then lean into y'all's questions. So first, thinking about all of these groups together, how does mapping these groups help us to understand how Indonesia is unique in the Muslim world, right? A lot of times folks talk about Indonesia is different from other Muslim countries. Is that because of the structural reasons of these mass Islamic organizations having people affiliate together as Muslims in a different way than other parts of the Muslim world? And then secondly, because we are based here in the United States, because I've got that great Southern Baptist background, is the analogy to mainline Protestant denominations useful to think about Indonesia not just in the context of the Muslim world, but Indonesia in the context of religious change over the last century around the world, right? Some of the same transformations that were happening in terms of religious communication, in terms of debates about liberalism, are not just unique to Indonesia, but common even in the United States in Christian communities. I've talked an awful lot. I talk very fast. Thank you so much for your patience. Saya mohon maaf kalau ada kesalahan, kekurangan dalam perbincangan ini. Let me turn it over to y'all.
Kevin, that was just wonderful. So thank you very much for that. And we'll go to questions now. I'm just curious to kick this off, how you would analyze the recent evolution of the idea of mainline organizations and whether you would include, for example, PKS, which you mentioned, as an organization which fits all of your four criteria. And as we were talking earlier, Wahda Islamiyah, a Salafi organization, which also meets all of your four criteria, but which doesn't enter into your mapping, your historical mapping. So maybe start with that and we'll open it up to the rest of you.
I'm going to steal this microphone back just so that the folks on Zoom can still hear me. This is one of the reasons why it's so great to talk with Cindy Jones. Her scholarship on Indonesia is fantastic, and it's great to be challenged in this way. And my gut reaction is I do not want PKS or Wahda Islamiyah to be part of this category, because I think that they are interested in doing different things. They grew in a different way. But I think that the structural mandates of the way that Indonesia functions has pushed them to follow the model of an NU, a Muhammadiyah, an Al-Washliyah. So PKS or Wahda Islamiyah, when they were born, were not doing those things and was largely not interested in some of those things, but has been pushed in that direction because of the way that the Indonesian state, to be legible to the state, they've had to go in that way. And I'm going to push on PKS especially because a lot of the educational groups associated with PKS are not technically a part of, it's certainly not a PKS, or even of, the Tarbiyah movement, which doesn't have the same sort of clear, open structure, right? Sekolah Islam Terpadu functions differently. They have an organization for themselves, but it is not structurally under the PKS command. And the the family communities that they're establishing, in urban centers and on university campuses are also operating a bit independently and not transparently. And so when you get down to the nuts and bolts, they look different on the ground, right? An area that I'm happy to debate. I think of them as functioning differently. Now, Wahda Islamiyah is an interesting group, and that one's sort of like Hidayatullah out of Kalimantan, is a late arrival to the family of what could be a mainline Islamic organization, but could fall in. Al Khairat among the groups that I mentioned is maybe the most theologically conservative, not just in their veneration of Arabs, but also in the ways that they sometimes have talked about the violence between Christians and Muslims in Sulawesi. Al Khairat has a lot of conservative people in it, has some very, tolerant liberal people in it, but it has some really conservative people in it. So seeing this as a spectrum that could encompass a Wahda Islamiyah, possible, not what I love, but this is why you want to put scholarship out there and get people thinking about it, right? How different are these groups?
Okay, that's great. We have some questions online, but let's take a question from the floor. And can you use the microphone so that we can make sure that everybody hears?
Thank you so much. My name is Alsha Fedra. I'm from Indonesia and I've attended both of your events in Indonesia. So I just wanted, I'm currently studying Islamic studies at Columbia University. So I wanted to, because they don't do a lot of Southeast Asian Muslims at the Middle Eastern Institute. So I'm very interested in coming here. And I was just wanted to put in my few cents on the argument because I did my undergrad in Universitas Indonesia. And the fact is, Tarbiyah is a very interesting organization in the sense that it's underground, basically. People don't say that they're Tarbiyah. And there's also this type of, people would say that, oh, it's just a type of pengajian or a type of like, oh, we're just kind of gathering around as study groups. It's actually Tarbiyah. So people won't say that they're Tarbiyah. And there's also this kind of, people who are skeptic will say conspiracy, but there's a lot evidence pointing that it's not a conspiracy, that all of the student leaders of the BEM, I don't know how to say BEM in English. Yeah, the student executive councils, there's this debates that the leaders that are nominated are from Tarbiyah's group, and then they're going to be against the NU, like the student organization who are affiliated with the NU, while NU and Muhammadiyah's students who are like, they're very like, oh, we're from NU, like we are representative of students from NU, we're representative of students from Muhammadiyah. So like, it's very interesting seeing that. And I remember people would whisper about it because they're scared of being called radical and getting kicked out of the university. Because there's all of this accusations going around of radicalizations in university campuses, and people will be get scared that they're just gonna kicked out of OE, basically. So I'm leaning more towards your argument because of my firsthand experience, but we'll see. I mean, there's not a lot of research about them, unfortunately. So it'll be interesting to know more.
There's some really good stuff on the Tarbiyah movements and certainly on PKS. We've got plenty of good scholars from PKS. But on the Tarbiyah movement, there's some really interesting stuff. One of the problems we have is because Tarbiyah is quasi-underground and because Tarbiyah has so many different faces, right? The Sekolah Islam Terpadu is very different than the on-campus organizations, is very different than the political face, is very different than the fundraising for Palestinian Muslims that they also do, right? Some of which goes to Palestinian Muslims, some of which goes into people's pockets. And so because those different faces seem so disconnected, the scholarship is usually siloed into one of those things. Whereas when you look at scholarship on NU or Muhammadiyah, it's looking at the organization comprehensively. So that's one of the challenges of doing that work on a movement like the Tarbiyah movement or PKS.
We have two, we can take this out, I think, can't we?
Yes.
Oh, okay. So there's a question from Eric White. How and why are these mainline Islamic organizations the backbone of Indonesia's civil society, which you mentioned? And to what degree is this due to their strength versus the weakness of alternative civil society organizations and associations? And maybe it's worth thinking about the difference between civil society in the form of ORMAS or mass organizations and civil society in the form of NGOs.
Yeah, love it. Great question. Thank you to Dr. White, and thank you also for joining us virtually. There are moments when the NU Muhammadiyah have been more prominent in this. There are moments when they have been less prominent in this. again, I'm going to lean on my Southern identity. Praise the Lord. I'm delighted to be from Virginia. You know, take our knocks and all. One of the things that we learned in the South is that the communities that survived, the communities that gave us so many great leaders in the 1960s, were African-American religious communities, because religious communities were allowed to thrive, right? And so you get a disproportionate number of reverends in the civil rights movement, not because, you know, this is clearly an evolution of theology, you know, plenty of white theologians didn't see civil rights, but because the church was a place where those folks could be leaders. I would say a similar thing about Indonesian Muslim leaders, that in the period of Dutch colonialism, in the period of Suharto's oppression, that you still had to have religious leaders, and that was a place where they were allowed to speak. And so you got some really interesting alternative voices pushing against regimes out of those religious communities. And that's one of the reasons why you have individuals like Abdurrahman Wahid, Amin Rais, and many others who were doing some of that work in resistance to Suharto in the 1990s. The other thing I want to say, Indonesia is famously organizationally friendly. I think it's M. Stephen Fish and Danielle, I'm going to forget her name, at Grinnell College, the political scientists, who wanted to find an explanation for why did Indonesia, which transitioned to democracy in the 1990s, survive as a democracy, flawed as it is, for many years, and Russia, which transitioned to a democracy in the 1990s, not survive as a democracy, right? You would think Russia, that has such a higher education level on average for its people, that has a higher income level on average for its people, that it would have the tools to be a democracy further into the future. One of the things that Indonesia has that Russia definitely does not have, they looked at these sort of social sciencey surveys. As a historian, I don't always go in for them, but this was an interesting one that said Indonesians are the country in the world, the single most likely to have formal affiliations with people outside of their workplace. Because Indonesians are involved in a religious organization. Indonesians are involved in a community organization, right? They're RT, RW, whatever. Indonesians are often involved in an ethnic organization, right? The society to uphold the adat of their ethnic community. Indonesians are involved in a soccer community or playing tiddlywinks or whatever it's going to be. Indonesians like to get involved in organizations. And wear uniforms, but all of the trappings, right? The flag, right? The songs. So these organizations will have their own march that is composed and they'll sing it, right? These organizations will have their own bai'ah, their own pledge of allegiance to the organization. Love these things. And you get that certainly for the Islamic organizations, but sometimes you get it for the ethnic community or for the whatever. You'll get a flag or a decoration on the gate for your neighborhood, right? Indonesians like organizations. The reasons that I think that these mass Islamic organizations are the backbone is because they are the truly national organizations in that spectrum, where you get people on the ground in villages from Aceh all the way out to Merauke, who are going to be the local Muhammadiyah guy, where their passion is to go to the Muhammadiyah events and to propagate Muhammadiyah and to really keep that discourse alive. So when they get the Muhammadiyah newsletter, today they might get it as a WhatsApp, before they would be getting it in mail over the course of weeks for it to reach the local village, that they were engaged in that national conversation. And that's one of the reasons why I think that they are the backbone more than these NGOs, right? In terms of keeping a debate alive in the big cities, yes, NGOs are doing amazing work. And they are pushing the conversation forward in a way that NU and Muhammadiyah are not always willing to do. But in terms of having a national conversation that's the backbone of a civil society, it's hard to beat the mass Islamic organizations, truly.
I think Margaret might have some commentary on that later, but let me take a next question here. To what extent, this is from Brian Queek, to what extent is the early history of these organizations tied to the perception of threat to an imperial regime? For example, was a mainline organization modeled in part on Catholic missionaries palatable enough to authorities in a way that an exclusively or predominantly secular political organization like PKI was not? More generally, were non-religious organizations another model for some of these, quote, modern, end quote, forms? And would that matter for your analysis?
Love it. Thank you to Professor Queek, Professor Queck. I'm delighted to have you in here, and thank you for thinking through this with me. You have given one of the counterexamples of what these folks might have been modeling themselves after or against. I want to point out some of the other groups that these new types of modern organizations were formulated in contradistinction to, which is traditional Sufi brotherhoods, right? So if you look at who the Dutch were really afraid of, yes, they were certainly afraid of some political groups, but they were afraid of groups that met in the dark of night on Thursday evenings usually, and chanted in a language the Dutch could not understand, and had rituals of initiation, and had secret membership. And that looked really dangerous. So the province where I spent an awful lot of time when I was doing my dissertation research was West Sumatra. And West Sumatra had an uprising in 1908 that was in some ways tied to a crunch in silver around the world. So you didn't have enough money to circulate, and people had to start paying their taxes in money and like couldn't do it, couldn't pay in kind. The organizers for that, also for 1889, for a number of uprisings in Dutch East Indies between 1875 and 1915, were Sufi-based, somewhat secretive Islamic organizations. And a group like Muhammadiyah, when it was founded in 1911, or a group like Sarakat Islam, when it was founded in 1908, 1906/1908, depending on which version you're looking at. These groups, by being modern, were legible to the Dutch colonial state, not just to the later independent Indonesian state, in distinction to the Sufi traditional ways that folks would organize themselves. And that was important. They were happening at the same time as political organizations. Certainly the founder of Muhammadiyah, Kiai Haji Ahmad Dahlan, was a member of Budi Utomo, which is seen as the forerunner of modern organizations. I don't love the historiography in Indonesia that highlights Budi Utomo so strongly, because Budi Utomo was a very elite organization. It was very focused on Javanese identity, not Indonesian identity. So it is a forerunner to Indonesian nationalism, is problematic. But at the same time, Budi Utomo did have some of these trappings of modernity that were important. To have official meetings, to have official offices where the people were elected, and to have, a formal stated goal that was public, right? To be legible to the Dutch colonial state is important. And so the interaction of Budi Utomo and Muhammadiyah at the beginning, and Mitsuo Nakamura talks about this when he does a close analysis of Muhammadiyah in a central Javanese town. He's saying that Budi Utomo is one model, right? A social organization, not necessarily a political one. In the very early days, actually an important model was Sarakat Islam, which later became Partai Sarakat Islam, and then Partai Sarakat Islam in Indonesia by the end of the 1920s. That organization, Kum political party, gave birth to PKI. PKI was a division, the Indonesian Communist Party was a division out of Sarakat Islam, pushed away in 1921. And so in some ways you would say that PKI, the communists, were inspired by the Muslims and not vice versa. Sarakat Islam and Muhammadiyah reached a lot of these areas well before PKI reached a lot of these rural areas. And so it's very hard for me to say that the communists or a political organization like that, even the ISDV, the socialist forerunner to the PKI, was not reaching some of these rural communities in the way that the Islamic organizations were. So I'm going to call them the forerunners, and these leftist political groups the imitators. It's a bold argument. It can easily be disagreed with. This is why academics leads to some really good and interesting conversations. Thank you for joining us.
Great. Are there questions here?
I just want to compliment you. I can't formulate a question because I'm trying to digest all the things I've never thought of before that you've made me think of. But I'm just, for the hell of it, I'll try. I'm thinking of Noah Wycliffe's trilogy, and it's centered on Java, which will be not appropriate to bring up, but I'm going to do it anyway. His thesis is the hegemony of a form of Islam and a dwindling down of its diversity almost. And I'm wondering how your art, because you have so much knowledge, fits in with his thesis. I can't come up with any other question, but I have so many things I want to ask you.
It's a fantastic question. And thank you not only for being here and for the great work that you're doing, making Indonesia so legible to non-experts. I love pointing people towards your articles, but also for prompting me to think through what Merle Wycliffe has done. So the late MC Wycliffe's, some of you might know him for the general history he wrote of Indonesia, but late in his life, he wrote 3 books about Islam on Java from the days that Islam arrived on Java until the 20th century. And the last of those books from 1930 until when he published it, which I'm going to say was 2012, around that, was really talking about the disappearance of traditional syncretic or mystical traditions and the absolute dominance of textually based, Arab-oriented religious orthodoxy and orthopraxy. And that is a very good story to tell, and it's a very true story. Some of these mainline organizations are part of that, and Muhammadiyah certainly is one. Muhammadiyah is definitely teaching more people to be literate, asking more people to go to the text and drive things themselves. That is leading more people, it's sort of expediting that transition, along with globalism and more people going on the Hajj and more interaction between nations, right? All of these are part of it. But teaching more people, as these Islamic organizations did by offering educational experiences to a wider and wider proportion of the Muslim population, is pushing that direction. But in fact, today, one could easily argue that the mainline Islamic organizations that I am most interested in are in fact protectors of some aspects of the traditional ethnic identities, not necessarily the syncretism. And they are drawing a line between the religious belief and the cultural practices. But an organization like Darul Da'wah wa Irshad in South Sulawesi is in fact protecting the speaking of Buganese in religious contexts, is protecting the writing of Buganese script for theological purposes, is protecting some of the Buganese music and cultural traditions as part of their pesantren, because they want to be the pesantren organization, the religious network for Buganese people, right? Parti is still engaged in traditional Sufi practices, and Parti is hand in glove with a Sufi organization. NU is much more accommodating of Javanese culture than, for example, Muhammadiyah. There's jokes about NU Muhammadiyah. There's all kinds of jokes about NU Muhammadiyah, partly because Abdurrahman Wahid, or Gus Dur, Indonesia's fourth president, was a hilarious jokester in addition to being the head of NU, right? But one of the things that they say is like, in a local Javanese mosque, when it goes from being majority NU to being majority Muhammadiyah, you lose the mosque drum, you lose the bell, right? Because NU would often use a mosque drum to call people, not just a spoken call to prayer. And would use a bell as part of the ritual of when you're supposed to do your raka'ah in the 5 daily prayers. When you lose the mosque to Muhammadiyah, you lose the bell, you lose the drum. When you lose the mosque to PKS, you lose the mosque, right? And so you lose all of these things that there's some accommodation for, mixing in Javanese language, mixing in Javanese traditions, all these things. Lose all of that. You just want to act like you are Arabs who happen to be in a tropical place and have slightly darker skin. And so in a lot of ways, NU and even Muhammadiyah are seen as protectors of some of these local traditions, certainly against the new wave of organizations, the Wahda Islamiyas, the Tarbiyah folks, the Felix Xiaos of the world, right? That mainline Islamic organizations today, although they were pushing new frontiers in the 1920s and 30s, today they might be seen as the ones who are protecting local ethnic identities. The one that stands out in this way is certainly Nahdlatul Watan, because the founder of Nahdlatul Watan wanted it to be intensely Sasak. And so even today, his heirs, more in the Enwe side, less in the Enwe Dei associated with the grandson who took over in the Mutamar Reformasi, is still having the ceremonies where they will give the first haircut to toddlers, is still talking in the poetry about Dewi Anjani, the protector of the Gunung Rinjani. This part we're going to have to not keep in the recording that goes on YouTube because I'll get in trouble for it. But just for our friends who are watching live and our friends in the room, I had a long conversation with Siti Rai Hanun, who's the daughter who took over in 1998. And she made pilgrimages up to the top of Rinjani to have spiritual communion with the guardians of the mountain as the only way that she could take over this thing, right? That certainly sounds like Merle Rickliff's mystic synthesis to me. And that was 1999. She, as a woman in her 50s, has to hike up this mountain and crawl into a cave in the mountain to have mystic synthesis with the mountain in order to be able to lead Nahdlatul Watan. 99. And the woman still lives.
Okay, let's go to David.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm Dave Timberman. I used to do some work in Indonesia, so this was a wonderful refresher, but also expansion upon. And I want to ask two questions about the three third largest mainline organizations. One pertains, so how do they engage with political parties? Because with NU and Muhammadiyah, they have national aspirations, well, and presence largely, but But so these are the ones that you described are more regional in nature, it would appear, right? So there's maybe a little bit of a difference there, right? And then secondly, I'm just not current on the whole debate on Pancasila and how, I mean, but under Joko Widodo, it's been greater emphasis again. Anyway, so I'm curious how those organizations engage in that issue as well. Thank you.
Thanks for coming out. Great to have you here. There's two dynamics to how these organizations engage with political parties. One of them is historically, right? What have they done over the century of their existence, and especially since Indonesian independence? The other is across the different organizations. And in both cases, both historically and across the geography, they have different strategies. One of the things that I have argued, certainly in person, soon to argue this in print, that has gotten the biggest pushback from Nahdlatul Watan, certainly. One of the reasons why Nahdlatul Watan had to formalize as an organization in 1953. Any historical scholars in the room want to say why 1953 was such an important year for Islamic politics? Indonesia in 1945 had the establishment of Masyumi, a mass Islamic party that was supposed to be the singular Islamic party. It wasn't, but it was supposed to be the singular Islamic party. And in the end of 1952, NU left. And Masyumi was dead scared that all of the Shafi'i theologians, all of the people who followed the 1400 years of accrued theology would leave Masyumi. And they said, we need to get a bunch of institutional supporters that are theologically Shafi'i. So Nahdlatul Watan became a formal organization at the urging of some of the Masyumi leaders in 1953, so that Masyumi could then list them as a formal supporter of Masyumi and say, oh no, we do both sides of the theological spectrum, the reformists and the traditionalists, right? No, they didn't become an anggota istimewa like Jamiat al-Washliyah did. And they definitely didn't support P3, the state-authorized Islamic party from 1971 until 1998. But like Jamiat al-Washliyah was all in on P3 and suffered mightily for it. The founder of Nahdlatul Watan looked around, looked at the options, said, you know what? Suharto's going to give me the best deal. I'll be Golkar. And so he pushed his people to support Golkar in all the elections except the, 81, when Golkar took its real hits to P3. And he was actually a Golkar deputy in the National Assembly for one term in the 1970s. Since Reformation, since 1998, these parties have gone all different ways. Jamiat al-Washliyah has actually said, we're not going to join one single party. We're going to be across all the parties, and that's how we're going to maximize our influence. And that's why they can have the largest caucus in the North Sumatra Provincial Assembly. It's across, for a while it was across all of the different parties except for PDS, the Christian party that is now defunct. Partai Damai Sejahtera. Al-Khairat has bounced back and forth between parties. They want to support one party, but they haven't been able to make a deal that brings them enough profit. So they bounce back and forth. Nahdlatul Watan has been all in on parties, and every time they are unable to convince their followers politically, even though they're very able to convince their followers theologically, and even to go into violence, right? They've had violence between NW and NWDI communities, especially in the period between 2000 and 2005. Like, people have died, houses have been burned, property has been destroyed, but they've been unable to convince their voters to support the national party that they want. However, NWDI, I mean, the grandson, was the two-term governor of the province of West Nusa Tenggara. And when he finished and was term limited and couldn't continue, he got his sister onto the ticket as the lieutenant governor for West Nusa Tenggara province. And they just romped. I mean, all of the NWDI followers voted for those tickets because the aura, the charisma of the founder is on that man. And Tuan Guru Bajang, for a while, until he had a bit of a scandal involving polygamy, he was a likely candidate. He was on everyone's shortlist to be the vice president for Jokowi's second term, because he was young and he was Islamic and he was from the outer islands, and those were things you want to line up. In the end, Jokowi, went with an NU guy, but Tuan Guru Bajang, or Zainal Majdi is his official name, was definitely a realistic candidate until about a year before this election. He had a kerfuffle about a second wife, and it all went downhill.
How did a follow-up to that, just on the issue of the connection between politics and these organizations. As the concern on the part of the state about radicalism and extremism rose, to what extent did that push all these organizations to become closer to the state, if not enforcers of the state?
Yeah, great question. So in the last 25 years, we've had different waves of concern about radicalism. For a while, that was about violent radicalism leading to terrorist attacks, bombs, and attacking churches and things, right? So that's up to 2009, maybe. And in those periods, all of these organizations were vehemently denouncing the kind of terrorism that happened in this city in 2001 and the kind of terrorism that happened in Jakarta and in other cities in Indonesia, right? Bali. So none of these groups wanted to support bombings against non-Muslims. However, there were individuals who had certainly educational affiliations and maybe more to some of these organizations, especially some of the regional organizations, who were caught up in attacks on local Christians in places like Palu, in places like Aceh, right? In conflicts over land in Papua, right? You had some of the branches of these organizations. So there was definitely Muslim-Christian tension, but not the internationally oriented terrorism. Since 2009, the rhetoric around, I mean, for a while, the rhetoric around radicalism went away, and it's come back in recent years. And it's been less about bombings that are internationally oriented and we love Al-Qaeda. And it's been more a rhetoric about you don't like Indonesia enough. You're not sufficiently supportive of the national project. You might want to create a caliphate. You know, we're going to outlaw Hizb ut-Tahrir Indonesia because it's not sufficiently Pancasila-ist, right?
Or it was against the Ahok, you know, like
Yeah.
reactions.
On paper, because they're not sufficiently Pancasila-ist. So a number of these organizations were also against Ahok, right? Zain al-Majdi of Nahdlatul al-Watan marched in 212 in the December 2nd, 2016 rally against Ahok. The fatwa from MUI was read out by the head of Jamiat al-Washliyah. He's the guy who's on the dais reading that out. Not in your Muhammadiyah. He was the third in line, so we got to read it out. Some of them have come back into line. All of them are hungry for patronage. Most of them have found ways to accommodate with the state to keep that patronage flowing. Especially when you're a smaller organization, you have less room to push back, right? So Enwe, Al Khairat, Jamiat al-Washliyah need to keep the Ministry of Religion patronage flowing. And so don't want to be on the bad side. So when Jokowi put his foot down and said, you know, you can be HTI or you can be on the good side. They said, we're on the good side. We're the little NUs, right? These organizations already had divisions in them, but they're not dividing along the Ahok lines that we saw that are now riving NU and Muhammadiyah. Their divisions are other things, largely personal.
Let me just see if there are any, since you had another question?
I think we don't have enough time.
Okay, we have 2 minutes, and David had a second question as well.
Just about Pancasila. I mean, you sort of gave the context just by what you just said, but I assume they are. Well, no, go ahead. So are they all pro Pancasila?
So since 1959. Yeah, since 1959, they've been pro Pancasila. Many of them advocated for changing the foundation of the state in the Constituante that met from 1956 to 1959 to draft Constitution for Indonesia. When Sukarno unilaterally disbanded that, they said, okay, we accept Pancasila. And since 1965, when you swear into these organizations, because they all have an oath, a pledge, a bond that you make as official swearing in, you pledge your loyalty not just to the organization, but also to Indonesia, UUD 45, the 45 Constitution, and to Pancasila. Right, that's written into the pledges for Al Khairat, Jamiat al-Washliyah, and Nahdlatul al-Watan since 65 or 66. I think that's the Pancasila question.
That's much. And did you want to have one more comment?
It was more
This
about,
is be the final.
yes. What you were saying about how Muhammadiyah and NU and them being, but your question also about the mysticism. There's this interesting paper by a professor. She just got tenure at Leiden University. Her name is Professor Ferna Meyer. Yes, she did. She went into our class and she spoke about her paper about cultural ambiguity by Thomas Bauer. And she did anthropological research on Muhammadiyah. And she was saying that, you know, Muhammadiyah tell us that we don't believe in mysticism, we don't believe that, but in practice, especially about ziarah kubur, like visiting graves of of like Muhammadiyah leaders, that's not the case. So she was arguing against like this cultural ambiguity that Thomas Bauer was saying that like, oh, in modern times, if there's no cultural ambiguity. And she's like, there is actually. So I would argue against your argument saying about how Muhammadiyah and NU, I think there's still a lot of, and the funny thing is that people like this, they don't want to talk to foreigners. That's the most, and I think Professor Ferrena, she was able to because she could speak Japanese. So she was able to kind of like wiggle herself into it. But even then, when we were having a conversation, she was saying that they could just suddenly change their mind and like, I don't want to talk to a bule. They would say that. And I kept on thinking how maybe it's because I grew up there. The mysticism part is like very much intrinsic to Indonesian society. They don't want to admit it, but it is. So I would say that the Muhammadiyah and NU, it's not like in practice, it's not that black and white, I guess.
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you very much to Kevin for a wonderful talk. And I hope we can continue the conversation informally afterwards. And thank you all for coming.